It's Friday, December 13th, and this is the Daily Medical News, where we bring you the top stories in clinical medicine, as well as a closer look at the day's biggest story. I'm Nick Andrews.
And I'm Mary Ellen Schneider. Today, reduced kidney function may signal fracture risk in older women.
And the American Society of Hematology has new advice on VTE prophylaxis after major surgery.
If Crohn's disease is mild, you may not have to treat.
A greater number of pediatricians are thinking and acting globally.
Plus, the FDA is looking into possible contamination of metformin products with NDMA. And now, the news.
Moderate reduction in kidney function in women around the age of 75 is linked with an increase in short-term risk of fracture. That's the major finding from a longitudinal cohort study published in the journal Osteoporosis International. Researchers found that compared with women with normal kidney function at age 75, women with immediate kidney function had a more than twofold higher risk of osteoporotic fracture within 2 years. It was a 1.5-fold higher risk up to 5 years. These women also had an elevated risk of hip fracture. But the study did not find an association with fracture risk for women older than 80 years or in those who had worse kidney function, and there was no significant association for 10-year fracture risk in women at age 75. Previous studies have found that many older women have reduced kidney function that is equivalent to a diagnosis of chronic kidney disease and that it is associated with bone loss. But there have been few studies looking specifically at that relationship in women without chronic kidney disease diagnosis.
The American Society of Hematology has released a slew of new recommendations for venous thromboembolism prophylaxis in hospitalized patients undergoing surgery. The group's new guideline tackles 30 key questions in this area, with a focus on clinically important symptomatic outcomes. That's according to Dr. David Anderson of Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, who chaired the guideline effort. Dr. Anderson highlighted several recommendations during a special education session at the annual meeting of the American Society of Hematology, held in Orlando. Among the highlights, the guideline recommends against pharmacologic prophylaxis for patients who experience major trauma who are deemed to be at high risk of bleeding. Prophylaxis does reduce the risk of symptomatic pulmonary embolism and deep vein thrombosis by about 10 events per 1,000 patients treated. But Dr. Anderson said this benefit is outweighed by the increased risk of major bleeding. Pharmacologic prophylaxis is recommended in surgical patients at low to moderate risk of bleeding, however. The incremental risk of major bleeding is outweighed in this case by the benefit of reduction in symptomatic VTE events. For more details on the guideline recommendations, click the link in the podcast notes.
And what's the best management of patients with mild Crohn's disease? It may be no treatment at all. Dr. Kim Isaacs is a professor of medicine and co-director of the Multidisciplinary Center for IBD Research and Treatment at the University of North Carolina. She said that no treatment may be appropriate if patients truly have mild disease and are not at risk for progression. Dr. Isaacs offered this advice at the annual meeting of the American College of Gastroenterology, which was in San Antonio, Texas. She said figuring out which patients are at risk for progression is a challenge, however. Risk factors for disease progression include having ileoclonic or perineal disease, being a smoker, having inflammatory arthritis or associated immune-mediated disease, and requiring corticosteroids to maintain remission. Patients with mild Crohn's disease and low risk for progression may have no symptoms or mild ones, a limited distribution of bowel inflammation, and normal or only slightly elevated C-reactive protein or fecal calprotectin levels. And they may have none or only superficial bowel ulceration on colonoscopy. For patients with mild disease, Dr. Isaacs urged monitoring closely for mucosal inflammation. And if patients do start to progress, you want to catch them early in order to get a good response on their first therapies. You can find more comments from Dr. Isaacs by checking out the link in the show notes.
Pediatricians are doing more than ever before to improve global health. That's according to results of 2 surveys that offer a snapshot of nearly 30 years of participation in global health activities. The surveys were fielded by the American Academy of Pediatrics, first in 1989 and later in 2017. Dr. Kevin Chan of the University of Toronto and his colleagues compared the responses. They found that participation in global health activities was 2% in 1989, but grew to 5% in 2017. Interest in future global health experiences rose from about a quarter of pediatricians to nearly 1/3. Pediatricians age 50 and older had a higher rate of recent global health experience in the surveys, with the largest increase in participation coming from doctors who are age 60 and older. The study was published in Pediatrics.
And finally today, the FDA is investigating possible contamination of forms of 2 types of diabetes metformin in the United States. The investigation was launched after reports of low-level contamination of metformin and nitrosamine, NDMA, surfaced in other countries. A few regulatory agencies have issued recalls of the drug, even though officials said the levels seen outside the United States are within the range that is naturally occurring in some foods and in water. FDA officials emphasized that there are no current U.S. recalls of metformin products, and there is no current evidence that metformin drugs in the U.S. or the European Union have been contaminated. The FDA and its counterpart in Europe have recently investigated the presence of NDMA and ranitidine, a drug that is used to reduce production of stomach acid. This led to several manufacturers issuing recalls. The agencies have also investigated angiotensin II receptor blockers, which are used to treat hypertension, heart failure, and blood pressure. While FDA officials continue to monitor the situation, they advise patients to continue taking metformin alone or in combination with their other drugs to control diabetes. They offered similar advice to clinicians, saying that the drug should be used when clinically appropriate since there are no alternatives to treat the disease in the same way. And that's a wrap for today's daily medical news. Be sure to check out the latest edition of the CardioCast and the Post Call podcast, which are both available on Fridays. For MD Edge, I'm Nick Andrews.
Our stories this week were contributed by Michelle Sullivan, Miriam Tucker, Greg Schwachtman, Richard Franki, Bruce Jansen, Alicia Gallegos, Neil Osterweil, Lucas Franki, Randy Dotinga, Steve Semino, Mitch Zoller, Bianca Nogrady, and Andrew Bowser. Our editors include Terry Rudd, Catherine Hackett, Gina Henderson, Elizabeth Mechkati, Jeff Evans, Lisa Nangolin, Mark Lesney, Laura McGlade, Laura Nicolaitis, and Renee Matthews. Our news team is led by executive editors Denise Fulton and Kathy Scarbeck. And I'm Mary Ellen Schneider. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here at 4 a.m. on Monday. Have a great weekend.